Hello, I'm Eric Bjornlund. I'm the president and CEO of Democracy International. As you know, I'm going to be the host this morning. I'm here with my colleague Aaron Myers. Democracy International is a longtime implementing partner of the U.S. Agency for International Development, working on democracy, human rights, and governance programs. I've been working with USAID for 22 years. I came to this work somewhat unexpectedly. I'm a lawyer, and I was working at a big law firm many years ago. I took on human rights pro bono cases in Namibia, which led me to an opportunity to work on the Namibian transition to independence in 1989, and I found myself in a career in democracy and human rights. Aaron, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Pleasure to be here. My name is Aaron Myers. I'm the Director of Global and Rapid Response Programs at Democracy International, also the Technical Director of the Justice, Rights, and Security Rapid Response Assistance Program, which was a very large USAID program that was designed to respond to human rights crises and rule of law window of opportunities around the world. Unfortunately, that program was canceled along with most of USAID programming, but delighted to be here to sort of discuss this topic.
So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but how did you get to be involved in international human rights work?
I think like many people, it's sort of a roundabout way. I studied human rights in college, I think just out of a feeling that I had it lucky in a global perspective and really wanting to pursue a career where I was helping other people. I started my career in human rights. It's at Freedom House, where I managed programs supporting human rights defenders at risk. So we had several large global programs where we were able to get people out of trouble when they were targeted by authoritarian regimes, non-state actors from very difficult situations. And being on a global program, I really got to see a wide snapshot of very common threats and tactics used against people who are speaking out or who are advocating for democracy and human rights. Some of it is sort of physical attacks, threats, bullying, but a lot of it comes from a legal perspective or sort of rule by law. So arbitrary detention, frivolous lawsuits, and also laws sort of designed to crack down on the civil society as a sector, sort of what we call often closing civic space. So laws targeting freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, laws that are put in place to sort of control the population, control dissent, control voices who challenge power. And so I've come to it from that angle. But I think oftentimes people hear rule of law and think about judges, lawyers, the justice sector narrowly. But I think it's so much more than that. It's such an important topic to be discussing with what's going on in the world today.
How did you come to do that work at Democracy International?
I joined Democracy International a couple years ago to lead the Justice, Rights, and Security Rapid Response Program, as I mentioned. This was really a unique program, and I think it was something that was innovative at USAID. We had a large consortium of partners with various geographical and technical expertise in human rights, justice, and security. And what we were able to do is respond very flexibly when crises occurred. So political violence against pro-democracy activists, regressive laws that are cracking down on specific populations, oftentimes also windows of opportunity. So I think one of the things we're most proud of at DI is that we were able to help the government of the Gambia to set up a hybrid court to prosecute cases from their dictatorship. And so it was really a flexible mechanism. It was low bureaucracy, very cost effective, these small targeted interventions helping local partners, move the ball forward or protect basic rights. And, unfortunately that's gone now. And it's a tool set that, the U.S. no longer has. And I think that's, the world is much worse for that. And there are many other programs like it that I think are gone that we need to find a way to replace.
What was the role of the U.S. Agency for International Development in that program?
So we worked very closely with USAID and USAID missions around the world. So they would often come to us when there was a problem that they couldn't address locally or in their existing programs. So oftentimes, political developments or, even sometimes non-state actors in a situation that's sort of a crisis and out of control, and they're trying to find ways to stabilize the situation. They would come to us and see if, either DI or one of our consortium partners would be able to start up a program. And we would be able to do that in a matter of weeks often. So designing the program, talking with partners, and then launching it and really getting to work. And so For those people who know about how USAID typically works or government grants typically work, it's often a very long timeline. There's a lot that goes into the design and procurement of those things. But this allowed us to move very quickly on a global scale and be very flexible, and also to pivot when the situations change on the ground. Our partners needed to change tactics. This program allowed us to do that, and I think it's the best example I've seen really of a program that has the flexibility built in to be able to avoid bureaucracy and get aid to people who need it most.
What was the feeling of the State Department, the diplomatic community, the senior AID officials about the program?
It was just overwhelmingly supported. I think every time we did one of these, I think it changed people's minds at missions even and in Washington about how programming could work, how flexible it could be, and how targeted it can be. We worked very close with missions, so they were very clear about what we were doing, but we were also able to sort of change as we went along. I think one thing that we've lost in sort of the foreign aid cuts is this sort of response capability. It's not just the financial resources, which are incredibly important. It's not just sort of the technical assistance that we were providing to local partners. It's also sort of the diplomatic role of the U.S. And so these programs enabled the U.S. to sort of, have a say in sort of what was going on when human rights were being targeted or rule of law was deteriorating in countries. And now that's largely gone. And something that I hear from local partners that are trying to protect human rights is that they really miss that diplomatic support and sort of that feeling of solidarity as much as sort of the resources themselves.
I'm sure you've been in touch with people that were beneficiaries of the program, with human rights defenders that we were working with and supporting, and others after the cuts have happened. What have they told you? What are they saying?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is they were incredibly understanding of the cuts. I think you might expect that wouldn't be the case. We were working with people in life-threatening situations, and then suddenly the program just had to stop midstream. They understood it was part of just a much bigger issue. I think the thing about supporting human rights defenders and why I'm drawn to it is these people are going to find a way to stand up on their own with or without us. They're going to keep finding ways to do the work, but it's clear that their job has become much riskier and much more difficult without these programs in place. And the Justice, Rights, and Security program is not the only one. There are emergency funds. There are other global response funds around sort of digital security, around civic space. Other mechanisms. The U.S. almost all of them are gone. It's upwards of $100 or $200 million of programming that the global infrastructure and civil society and human rights defenders globally really relied on, and that doesn't even take into account the specific country programs. So I think we're going to see that infrastructure really be stressed. I've already heard other providers that are funded by Europeans or philanthropists are already tapping out, and even in a few short months with the U.S. stepping out. And I think that's something that really scares me, is that huge void that I don't see how it's going to be filled without some really concerted efforts.
Why do you think Americans should care about international rule of law, international human rights issues, given what's happening in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I also think that the aid community, I saw everyone trying to pivot to make this sort of strategic case, this sort of self-interested case. And I think we do that a little too readily, honestly. I think, it's the right thing to do. I think people generally care about, they want to live in a world that is free from violence, free from oppression, free from slavery, free from, dictatorship. I think most people actually believe that. And I think retreating from that stance as it's the right thing to do is a little bit of a mistake, but I understand why people, we have to prioritize in what we support. But I would say the importance of, supporting international rule of law and international human rights issues is that the barrier between domestic and international is thinner than it has ever been in human history. These ideas are out there. I think been thinking a lot about the quote from Justice Brandeis that, states are the laboratories of democracy. I've heard that a lot about sort of, how we do democratic renewal in the U.S. But something that I saw for the past 20 years overseas is that a lot of these authoritarian countries were sort of laboratories for oppression. They were piloting tactics that we saw were copied, and then there became, a pretty clear set of playbook that we see now being applied in our own country. And it's, those ideas, cross boundaries, they cross borders. Sort of the narratives that are used to attack human rights, to attack, civil society groups have more power when they exist sort of out in the world. And if we don't counter them there, we will feel the effects back at home, as we are doing right now.
Well, as you know, the Democracy International has joined with a number of other implementing partners of USAID and the State Department to challenge the sudden terminations of the programs and the failure to spend congressionally appropriated funds as a violation of various laws and of the constitutional separation of powers. We have got a federal judge has agreed that we're likely to succeed on that and has given us a preliminary injunction to order that the programs be restarted and the funds be spent in the way that Congress appropriated them. So that case is continuing. It's on appeal to the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals. It's already been to the Supreme Court once on a technical issue. So we consider that a very important effort as well.
And certainly I've been incredibly proud to be a part of DI, as we've been engaged in that case. I think that is also so important for not only us and sort of the group of implementing partners that joined the case, but sort of the much broader world of people who rely on foreign aid, our partners overseas. They see that and really appreciate it when we are walking the walk at home and trying to fight for a rule of law in sort of our own countries. And the way it's just a fact with the size and import of the U.S. Everything that happens here affects people overseas. And so I think, something that I often got questions about from local civil society partners or even for people back at home when they would say, oh, why are we have problems in our own democracy. We have problems with human rights in the U.S. Why are you doing it overseas? Isn't that hypocritical? The answer I always said is, sometime in the future, we may need support from people overseas. And it's when we're going to be calling on our partners to learn from their experience pushing back and their successes and sort of the challenges that we need to look out for here at home. And again, to my earlier point, I think these issues transcend borders. We're all part of this, same struggle. And I think, we're going to need our friends and allies here in the future.
It was interesting when we were talking about whether to file suit and who was going to be involved in that. There were a lot of organizations that were reluctant to be involved because they were worried about blowback. They were worried about consequences. They were worried about being targeted for being a plaintiff in a lawsuit challenging the administration. And I said, and others, of course, said this too, we've been going around the world working with people who that we've implicitly encouraged, sometimes even explicitly, to challenge authority, to take risks, even to risk their lives. How can we not step up when we need to do that? And I'm proud of the group that agreed to do it. It includes the American Bar Association and a number of prominent USAID partner organizations. But we are really doing this, as you're suggesting, on behalf of the sector and on behalf of the cause of foreign assistance.
Yeah.
Do you have any other thoughts about that we should have talked about rule of law programming, human rights programming that you've been involved in or that you would advocate for?
No, I think one thing that is clear, foreign assistance for the U.S. is more or less gone in this space, at least for the immediate future. Hopefully, at some point it restarts. Hopefully there's some angles that the U.S. can take. But I do think we need, as a community, to come together and sort of reject this sort of false dichotomy about a U.S. program or an international program and think about how these issues intersect with one another. And that's something that, I've seen a lot of sort of mobilization for similar programs like we ran for the U.S., supporting people who are targeted for political violence, and as we saw in Minnesota just over the weekend. But I do fear that we can't become the struggle here is real, but we can't forget sort of the people that we've been working with overseas all this time, and forget how integrated those issues are with our what democracy at home. And so I do want to encourage people who are feeling motivated in the U.S. space to also continue to think through what our friends, allies, people who care about human rights and democracy overseas, and not to forget them at this time.
So, Aaron, why don't you explain to people kind of what we mean when we're working internationally about working on programs that support the rule of law?
I mean, I think it can mean a lot of different things, but at its core, it's about sort of accountability of institutions. It's about sort of equal application of the law. It's about law being sort of the ultimate decider about what happens in society. It means avoiding the selective use of the law to sort of target people. So I think it means sort of a level playing field for sort of everyone in society, that everyone is sort of held to the same standard, and to sort of a core set of values, often international values, but national values as well, that people have decided. And I think there's many ways to address that. Some of it is very specific work with lawyers, judges, the justice sector, helping them strengthen those institutions. Sometimes it's more of sort of a public awareness, so that there's awareness of what rule of law is, what ordinary citizens' role is in upholding rule of law or demanding rule of law. So I think sometimes USAID programs often are very technical in nature. They often are thinking about sort of bringing best practices or good practice from international contexts, and sort of so that people can learn and apply them in their own countries. But I do think that rule of law questions are much broader than that. There are questions about sort of the ideals that we have, the ideals that society strives for, and sort of common values, and how we agree and to uphold those values in a society.
So the recent trend in rule of law programs in U.S. government-funded programs has been to support people-centered justice, to move away from just supporting institutions, helping judges be well-trained and prepared, working on the administration of courts and the like, but moving into the concept that was called people-centered justice. What was the significance of that?
I think it was really a recognition that institution strengthening is still important, but that these sort of outcomes of these programs and the outcomes for sort of ordinary people are what's most important. And there's not a one model or one world model that is the best. It's there's a lot of customary practices that work overseas and in certain communities and societies, and those need to be taken into account. And sort of the ensuring that people's experience with the justice sector, with rule of law, is meaningful and something resulting in outcomes that work for them. Because I think too often, and you can point to the U.S. for many communities, would also say we don't have rule of law. For some communities, there people are left out. The people are not getting sort of the outcomes that they should be from our system, and that we have a long history of trying to improve that in our own country, and we'll have a lot of work ahead as some of those institutions and norms erode in the U.S. space.
In Bangladesh, we had a program we were very proud of that provided legal aid to people and tried to be inclusive for marginalized populations, to involve them into the legal system. It also, you mentioned this, provided education to people about what their rights were and what kind of legal support they could find. I think that was an important people-centered justice kind of initiative that we were involved in Bangladesh for some years.
Yeah, and I think people can just look at the news and they can sense in the U.S. system that oftentimes I feel like there are different tiers of justice, that their rules seem to apply differently based on your resources, based on who you are, based on your political connections. And I think that's incredibly damaging to society when that's the case, that there's not sort of one set of laws for all citizens. And I think that's core to rule of law work, is making sure that we're all held to the same standard. We all have the same rights. We have all the same duties and responsibilities under the law.
And I think in many of the cases challenging administration actions recently, the issue is about whether the executive branch will comply with the rule of law and comply with orders from the judicial branch about the executive branch's legal obligations. It's a very touchy time. Well, thank you very much, Aaron. It's good talking to you, and thank you for your good work on the Justice, Rights, and Security Program and in support of human rights generally. And I hope we have success in convincing people to do more of that in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure to be here.